Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is a special live episode of Dispatches. 9 months into Israel's genocide in Gaza, the atrocities continue to pile up in shockingly unprecedented ways. To discuss the latest developments as my electricity goes out, bear with me, I am joined by Mouin Rabbani, co editor of Jadalia. My electricity is just about to come back on. Mouin, I'm talking to you from Beirut, so it's to be expected.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Welcome back. Welcome back to the show. This is the welcome you get.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you again.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you back on. I am such a fan of your analysis, and I'm so excited to get into many, many, many topics with you. And there's my electricity again, so we can just jump right into it. Um, so, to be serious here, we're obviously going to talk about some pretty heavy stuff. The last time I had you on the show, Mouin, it was December. And I think we had just hit the 2-month mark of the genocide in Gaza. And now here we are 9 months into this horrific onslaught, and Israel has dismantled every hospital in Gaza, right? There's been, most of the population has been subjected to this horrific siege. They're starving, they're thirsty, they've been displaced several times over. Hundreds of families have been completely wiped out. The Israelis are engaging in disgusting styles of torture. We know from a recent New York Times piece that they're actually sodomizing people to death in the concentration camps they've created around Gaza, where they've detained people, kidnapped people. And they keep celebrating their atrocities quite openly because they see no consequences, despite talk of red lines that the U.S. never actually cares when they're crossed. And I personally, at this point, it kind of scares me. I think probably a lot of people can relate to this. I've become, I don't know if numb is the right word, but maybe a little bit numb. Like I don't have a visceral reaction anymore when I see these images coming out of Gaza of people just torn apart. And that freaks me out because it means, we're becoming desensitized to this horrific level of violence. So all that's to say, before we get into some more specifics, I'm just curious, what are your thoughts now that we've past the 9-month mark in this genocide? Did you think it was going to go on this long?
No, I didn't. And I, of course, expected the West to stand foursquare behind Israel, particularly as it has been doing. And but if you look at previous conflicts, there was really little indication that it would persist for almost a year, as it has done now, without either Israel becoming too exhausted to continue, or the West recognizing that its own interests are increasingly at stake and calling a halt to Israel's offensive, or indeed that the Palestinians would at a certain point just collapse and lose the ability to continue to resist Israeli aggression. But what we've seen is, on the one hand, the Palestinians proving to be much more effective in resisting Israeli aggression than I think many of us had anticipated. And here, let me just say, the Gaza Strip is 365 square kilometers. It's only marginally larger than the Caribbean island of Grenada, which the United States under Reagan invaded in 1983. Grenada had a regular army, it had a contingent of Cuban military advisors, and it took the US, I think, all of 36 hours to seize control of Grenada in its entirety and eliminate its leadership and so on. Here we have Hamas, which is Israel's weakest adversary in the region, fighting in the smallest territory among Israel's adversaries and being able to hold out for 9 full months. I do think the Israeli military and Israeli society is showing increasing signs of strain and dislocation and all the rest of it. But I think perhaps what we insufficiently accounted for is how far to the right Israeli politics and society have shifted, particularly during the past decade, which makes kind of their determination to fulfill this genocide stand above any costs that they bear for doing so. And I think the other aspect that needs to be specified is the continued, unwavering, uncritical support of the Biden administration, with the Europeans and the Brits, of course, ultimately tagging along. I can't imagine any other US administration, whether Democratic or Republican, having the same level of indulgence for Israel that we have seen this past year by the trio of Biden, Blinken, Sullivan. Well, let's add McGurk and a few others to that. But they basically will brook absolutely no limits, no opposition to their fanatic determination to stand behind Israel through thick and thin. There have, of course, been several instances where they have tried to push Israel in a different direction, but this hasn't gone beyond expressing verbal opposition, hoping that it changes something in the Israeli political equation. And when it doesn't, and Israel either pushes back or ignores the US admonition, we've repeatedly seen the US position simply collapse and get in line behind Netanyahu, Ben Gvir, Smotrich, and the rest of that gang.
I mean, yeah, I think that that's a really good point and a good segue when we mentioned the American role here. I have to say, I didn't think the Americans would allow it to go on this long, and perhaps it makes me extremely naive. And I think more just out of self-interest, not wanting the region to explode. But they've clearly made a decision that they feel they can allow the Israelis to go crazy as they want to in Gaza and somehow keep it contained there. We'll see how long that can go on if this continues. But I do want to bring it very, just briefly to sort of U.S. clown show that we're witnessing right now. And I want to play a clip here that's been making the rounds of Joe Biden. I know you've seen it. Probably many people who are watching have seen it. Oh, sorry if there was some tech issues there.
I couldn't hear the audio. Was that the clip of them saying no?
Oh, I'm so sorry if people couldn't hear that. I don't know what the deal was. Sorry, StreamYard. My apologies. That was a StreamYard issue. Maybe an issue with me. This is what happens when I try to do tech myself. But yeah, that was Biden saying that he's done more for the Palestinian cause than anybody else. And I'm curious what your thoughts are, first of all, on Biden saying that, but also let's bring it to the Democrats for a moment. Do you think, as we witness Biden, oversee this horrific genocide while also somehow claiming to do more for the Palestinian people than anybody else, do you think that we still have a duty to vote for Biden and the Democrats to prevent Trump's election, despite his disgusting support for this genocide? Because that's what we're hearing, that we have to vote for Biden and the Democrats. Otherwise, we are enabling fascism.
Mm-hmm. Well, essentially, you're asking me to choose between lung cancer and brain cancer. And when I tell you that I prefer not to be afflicted with either condition, you're then holding me responsible for the result. I think, that question should not be addressed. First of all, I should say I'm not an American, so voting or not voting is an issue that's irrelevant to me. But when you ask people to make a choice between two unpalatable possibilities, I think they are perfectly entitled to refuse to choose. And in this particular instance, and given the way that the issue has been presented, I think the onus is very much on the Democrats to present an alternative, to prevent an option that people are prepared to accept. You can't go to voters and say you have to vote for the genocidal candidate, because if you don't, you're going to get a fascist one. Who in their right mind is going to make an informed choice between lung cancer and brain cancer? It's simply not going. It's simply not going to happen. And I think it's the Democrats who have decided to leave people with no option but to abstain from voting or to sit out the election or perhaps to vote for a third party candidate or the Republican candidate or whatever. And what it shows essentially is that the Democratic establishment is prepared to hand the US government over to Donald Trump in order to defend Israel. That's really what's happening here. There are, of course, other issues. Biden's control of the process and so on. But let's be clear: he can be forced out in a week if that's a decision that's taken. But it's been decided that those who are sufficiently disturbed, outraged, enraged, whatever you want to call it, by Biden's foreign policy, are not going to be given an option they're prepared to vote for, even at the cost of handing the election to Trump.
I think that's a really great way to frame it, as you're choosing between two kinds of horrible cancers. So in that sense, does it matter who wins? And if so, in what ways would it matter? And then I'm just curious, since we recently saw the news about Donald Trump choosing his vice presidential candidate, JD Vance, if you have any thoughts on that particular choice in vice presidential candidate and what a Trump Vance presidency, which seems more and more likely, might look like for the region.
Well, from what I've seen of Vance, he's one of these typical US isolationists. In other words, does not support an activist foreign policy or throwing billions of dollars at foreign governments, of course, with the exception of Israel. When it comes to Israel, he's indistinguishable from the rest of the US political elite and establishment. He might give different reasons for doing the same thing, but at the end of the day, he does the same thing. I'll limit my response to your question to foreign policy, and particularly the Middle East. Of course, there are many other dimensions that I won't get into. But I think we need to understand that US Middle East policy is determined by the US and not by Israel, is formulated in a way that the US elites understand it to serve US interests, and that the key role in formulating these policies is done by institutions rather than individuals. So if you look at Trump's tenure between 2016 and 2020, you look at all the decisions he took on the US embassy, its location, on the recognition of Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem, on recognition of Israel's claims of sovereignty, rather, over the occupied Syrian Golan Heights and all the rest of it. This was presented as a radical break with traditional US policy, but in fact, it was a logical culmination of policies that had been increasingly pursued de facto by previous administrations, whether Democratic or Republican, and in fact conformed to US law in terms of legislation that had been repeatedly passed with an overwhelming bipartisan consensus by the US Congress. So then you get Biden. Well, did Biden reverse Trump's relocation of the US embassy? No. Did he reverse Trump's recognition of Israel's claims of sovereignty over Jerusalem? No. Did he reverse US recognition of Israel's claims of sovereignty over the occupied Syrian Golan Heights? He did not. Did he reverse Trump's recognition of Morocco's claims of sovereignty over the Western Sahara? Quite the contrary. He reconfirmed it. And not only that, he tried to take Trump's most important initiative, Arab-Israeli normalization, not at the conclusion of a peace process, but as an alternative to resolving the question of Palestine, took it to the next level and invested all his efforts into seeking Saudi-Israeli normalization, which for a number of reasons, I believe, was a non-starter to begin with. But that's a separate discussion. And so when we talk about the next US administration, whether it's a second Biden administration or a second Trump administration, I think we should not only focus on the individuals concerned, but we also need to understand um, a process that has been developing organically, and that for the most part, I don't think when it comes to US policy towards this region, that there will be as big a distinction between Trump and Biden as people assume. I mean, to give another example, Iran, of course, yes, a nuclear agreement was reached under the Obama administration. Trump unilaterally renounced this international agreement. Did Biden rejoin it? He did not. And so there will be differences depending on who's at the helm. But we can already see, I think, some changes in the region, which is you suggested that Trump is increasingly likely to win this election. Well, you're not the only one who believes that. You have leaders throughout the region who believe that as well. And they are already, let's say, withholding certain policies that they feel would help Biden win the election, either because they prefer a second Trump administration or because they think this will ingratiate them with Trump after he wins. So why give it to a lame duck when you can give it to someone who's going to be there for the next 4, or for all we know, the next 40 years? So
Right.
that's kind of the current situation as I see it.
Well, I wanna move to the media, but first I do want to remind people who are watching to make sure you smash that like button. It helps boost us in the algorithm, and make sure you're subscribed if you're not already. And with that out of the way, I also just want to apologize again for that audio. Somebody in the comments made a very funny comment. They said, "Oh no, there's no audio. I can't hear Biden lying."
Well, if I
So
may, I would just like to briefly comment on that.
yeah,
You
please.
mentioned Biden saying no one has done more for the Palestinian people or the Palestinian cause. That isn't what he said. He said no one has done more for the Palestinian community. And I
Mm,
think, we keep talking about Biden having all kinds of cognitive challenges and so on, and much of that may well be true. But when it comes to this issue, he knows exactly what he's doing. He's a conviction politician. This is his policy. And if you look at statements by those who have resigned from his administration, they repeatedly make the point that policy towards Israel and Palestine is very closely held within the White House by Biden personally, and in cooperation with his longtime aides, Blinken and Sullivan. And I think the reason he used the term Palestinian community, because he doesn't recognize them as a people, let alone a people with a cause, let
mhm.
alone a people with legitimate grievances against his favorite state. And he may, of course, he's lying when he says, when he talks about how much aid he has been able to force Israel to let into the Gaza Strip. But from his point of view, the Palestinian question is at most a humanitarian one. It doesn't have fundamental political roots that need to be addressed and resolved, let alone addressed and resolved at the expense of the interests of the Israeli extreme right. He is a self-declared Zionist, and in the midst of this genocide, he is a proudly self-proclaimed genocide. That, in a sense, tells you all you need to know about this character.
Yeah, I mean, and he's been saying it for his entire career. I want to move to the media because I think it's so interesting that, and interesting is an understatement, but I think it's quite interesting that, last week we saw this report from Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, essentially confirming what's already been reported by other Israeli outlets, by some other alternative media outlets in the West, that Israel on October 7th instituted on a mass scale what they termed the Hannibal Directive, which is an Israeli military policy that essentially gives the Israelis permission to shoot, to kill soldiers, to prevent their capture, to be used as hostages, to prevent their enemies from having leverage in prisoner exchanges. The Israelis have used this policy in the past. However, October 7th is the first time we've seen it used on a grand scale against essentially Israeli civilians. And so we've known this. Those of us who've been following the story have known this. The media in the US has been completely silent about it. But it was incredibly surprising because Haaretz has this article essentially backing it all up with Israeli military communications. And I searched every day since then to see who's covered this, because I know that the editors at these major American media outlets are scanning the Israeli press every morning to see the news from Israel. And the Israeli press, by the way, did cover this Haaretz story in English. A lot of the outlets did. I've only so far seen The Guardian, the British news outlet, The Guardian, cover this. I could be wrong. I might have missed something. The New York Times till now has not. The Washington Post till now has not. I'm waiting to see that CNN investigation. I could go on and on. And I guess, my question for you is, what do you think is behind this radio silence? It's kind of stunning to witness.
Well, it challenges an essential part of the narrative. I mean, the way that the Palestinian attacks of October 7th have been presented is they've effectively been decontextualized from the Israeli-Palestinian context, and they're repeatedly proclaimed as the single largest murder of Jews since the Holocaust, as if we're in Central Europe and not in the Middle East, as if these people were solely attacked on the basis of their identity as Jews, and has nothing to do with them being Israelis and Israel being in occupation of Palestine, and so on. And so I think it fundamentally challenges the narrative that we have been repeatedly fed by Israel and through Israel by mainstream Western corporate media. I should also add, just getting back to the earlier discussion about Biden, because I think it also applies to this issue. I think we have to recognize that there is a very deeply embedded racism recently towards Muslims, on a more longstanding basis towards Arabs, and specifically towards Palestinians, irrespective of their faith, which is very deeply rooted in the United States, in the U.S. establishment, and particularly among U.S. politicians who have been baying for Palestinian blood nonstop now for 10 months. And you see, I think, quite a bit of that in the media. If you look at the New Republic, for example, before it basically specialized in anti-Palestinian racism. And you've seen a lot of this in the mainstream media as well. And you take someone like Biden, who is very much a product of the U.S. political establishment during the Cold War, during this period when Arabs were systematically dehumanized and demonized and so on. I think we see a lot of that back in his current policy. I mean, this is someone who can't even feign fake empathy for dismembered Palestinian children, if only for opportunistic reasons of bolstering his own election campaign. He's constitutively incapable of doing that. And I think we need to recognize that. As far as the media is concerned, just to get back to your question, the Hannibal Doctrine basically states that a dead Israeli soldier is better than an Israeli POW. And we saw several instances of this in 2014 during Operation Protective Edge, I believe in the Shuja'iyya neighborhood of Gaza City and in Rafah, where Israel launched massive air and artillery raids in order to prevent the capture of Israeli soldiers, killing dozens of Palestinian civilians in the process. And what happened on October 7th is, as you mentioned, this directive was applied on a mass scale, not only to prevent the capture of soldiers, but also to prevent Israeli civilians from being taken hostage inside the Gaza Strip. And I think what's still needs to be determined is what proportion of Israeli casualties, and particularly Israeli civilian casualties in October 7th, can and should be ascribed to the actions of the Israeli military and its Air Force in particular, as opposed to Palestinian militants. I think it's an unanswered question. Quite clearly, many Israeli civilians were killed by Palestinian militants, but it appears to have been quite exaggerated as well.
Yeah, and then of course this extends into the issue of the mass rape that was being reported as fact, despite hole after hole in this narrative, which has essentially fallen apart. But almost every mainstream media outlet pushed this, essentially, trying to justify what Israel's doing in Gaza. Uh, I really appreciated the way Arun Gupta wrote about it in Middle East Monitor. In the title, he called it an industrial scale Jim Crow rape hoax,
Yes.
referring, of course, to the fact that during the Jim Crow era, many Black men were lynched on false accusations, not even just of raping white women, but in some cases of whistling at a white woman. And so this is a genocide being justified on a lie. And I just want to clarify, by the way, had something like that happened, it still wouldn't justify a genocide. That said, what's really ironic about all this is there's actual evidence that the Israelis are engaging in the use of sexual assault and rape as a weapon of torture
On a
and
widespread
punishment.
scale.
Yes, in their prisons against those that they've kidnapped from Gaza. The New York Times came out with a really horrific report full of testimonies by Palestinians who've been held at one notorious concentration camp where they've kidnapped Palestinians, where they've been sodomizing men with hot metal sticks and in some cases killing them. I also, real quick, before I finish about the rape hoax, I do want to note, by the way, just to what you were talking about earlier, there was a New York Times report out today. I was reading through it before we started, before we got on this episode, and it was talking about the early June, so-called rescue attempt of those 3 Israeli hostages when Israel killed almost 300 Palestinians in the process. They destroyed 42 buildings. Damaged or destroyed 42 buildings in that so-called rescue operation. All that's to say, the Israelis are engaging in just mass cruelty. But of course, the irony with a lot of what they're accusing the Palestinians of is that they're the ones engaging in it. Actually,
every accusation is a confession, as the saying goes.
Exactly. So, I mean, I think with the rape hoax, it's a bit more nefarious than the silence about the Hannibal Directive, because so many media outlets engaged in spreading it, and then we didn't really see any mea culpas. So I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
Well, you're not going to see any mea culpas. The New York Times ran this major so-called investigative report, Screams Without Words, which should properly have been entitled Screams Without Evidence. And Arun Gupta has done wonderful work exposing this hoax, this sham, and just as importantly, I think, placing it in its proper context, which is that when you have congenitally racist societies, such as Israel is with respect to Palestinians and Arabs, nothing mobilizes this racism and this hatred more than attacks on quote unquote our women and girls. And therefore, I think it will become clear that the mass rape hoax was premeditated from the first moment, in the first instance, to mobilize Israeli society in support of the Israeli government and military's subsequent genocidal actions. But then, just as importantly, to mobilize Western support, Western unconditional, uncritical support for Israel's genocidal campaign. And, in the West in recent years, Islamophobia has become flavor of the month. Palestinians are seen as a Muslim population. You already have this very deeply ingrained anti-Palestinian and anti-Arab racism throughout Western elites. And so accusing them of mass rape, is kind of icing on the cake, and it's a bit similar to the babies and incubators story during the Kuwait crisis in 1991. There was very substantial opposition to the buildup to that war, but that story and its endorsement at the time by both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, for which I think Human Rights Watch apologized, but Amnesty never did. That really helped turn the tide in terms of mobilizing popular opinion behind the policies of the U.S. and the U.K. During that crisis. And I think the mass rape hoax has played a similar role. And when you talk about the media's role, well, you're talking about the same media that systematically promoted the Iraqi WMD hoax, within living memory. And we tend to belittle the Soviet media, the North Korean media, and so on as agents of the state. Well, do these corporate mainstream media really operate all that differently in functioning as a channel for official policy to help mold public opinion? In this particular case, at least the one I'm familiar with, I really don't see that significant of a distinction. And I think, I've been referring to the New York Times as American Pravda, and it seems to lose no opportunity to confirm that assessment.
Wow, I did not know that that Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch promoted the babies in incubators
Yes.
lie in the early 90s. That's
Yeah.
wild.
Yeah. And just since we're on the topic of Human Rights Watch, I believe today published a major, very
Yeah.
detailed report on October 7th, and it accuses Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups of a variety of atrocities, including war crimes and crimes against humanity. And very tellingly, it found no evidence for this mass rape hoax.
Mm.
It didn't reach the logical conclusion of saying this is a hoax concocted for political reasons. Instead, it relied on the non-investigative activities of others to say that further investigation is needed and there may be some evidence of this or that. But it found, despite its very extensive fieldwork, it found zero evidence for this hoax.
Well, so have basically anybody who's actually investigated it, including the UN, by the way. Um, I want to ask you to talk about something that you've discussed actually quite a bit, which is the ceasefire talks. And in that, I'm specifically talking about the fact that repeatedly we've seen a pattern from the Israelis where there's like movement on the ceasefire talks, and you've even seen compromises by Hamas and okay, we're willing to do it this way or this way. The Americans will get excited. The Israelis will kind of play along and then suddenly happens to change that changes everything and they fall apart. I'm curious if you can talk a bit about that. I know that, since October 7th, there's been maybe a dozen at this point times where ceasefire talks have taken place and then the Israelis have basically scuttled them.
Well, I think the main lesson we've learned is there's only going to be a ceasefire when Joe Biden picks up the phone, calls Netanyahu, and repeats the same statement he communicated to Netanyahu in 2021. Quote, "You've run out of road," end quote. And then it will immediately stop. Absent the US actually using its enormous leverage that it has with Israel. Well, one thing we've learned in the current crisis is how extraordinarily dependent Israel is on the US, militarily, politically, diplomatically, and so on. Absent a clear position by the US, it's not going to happen. And by clear position, I don't just mean Washington stating what it wants, but actually walking the walk and ensuring that this happens. If you look at the situation within Israel, it's a little more complicated. Previously, I think the entire security establishment and the entire governing elite, despite their little maneuvers, rejected a ceasefire for the reason that they are responsible for the biggest failure in Israel's admittedly short history on the 7th of October, 2023. There is going to be accountability for their strategic failures. And I think from their perspective, continuing the war in the hope of achieving some kind of strategic success would benefit them when the time for accountability comes. You're now seeing, I think, increasing divisions within the Israeli governing elite. And I think it would be too simplistic to say it's between the government and the security establishment. I mean, there are different factions within each, but there are some who I think are increasingly coming to the realization that you can't continue to throw good money after bad and expect to hit the jackpot. There are others who are looking at how Israel's regional position and posture is weakening with every day, and therefore feel there needs to be put an end to that, or they want to focus very much on a potential conflict in Lebanon. And then, of course, central to all this is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It's often presented as he needs to continue the war to stay in power. I think that's also a very simplistic explanation. Of course, he wants to stay in power, but he too, as the person who was in charge of the Israeli ship of state on October 7th, wants to end this in a way that he can say, okay, I may have made a mistake, but look at this enormous achievement. Gaza has been razed to rubble. Hamas has been eradicated. Each of its leaders has been blown to smithereens. The Palestinian population of the Gaza Strip now has no option but either to break into Egypt or make a mad dash across the Mediterranean. So there's that aspect. The other aspect, of course, is that the apocalyptic wing of his government, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, have made very clear that they will bring down the governing coalition if the war ends. And, you know, for them, they don't really care how much cannon fodder is expended. And in fact, they want to not only not end the war in the Gaza Strip, they want to expand it, intensify it in the West Bank, engage in a full-scale war against Lebanon, ideally probably nuke Iran or something. So those are the kinds of calculations that are at play here. And really the only thing that can lead to a breakthrough here is either much greater pressure from the Israeli domestic public, which is growing, but I don't for the present see reaching that level where it has a decisive impact on the Israeli government. Or as I mentioned before, Biden picking up the phone saying you've run out of road, which he's really not going to do, I think, anytime soon.
Yeah, Biden seems to be in it till the end. And I think it's a good point you make about the sort of factionalization of Israeli politics. And, you know, I think that when I'm talking to you from Beirut, which by the way, I saw someone in the comments wondering why my electricity went out. It's because I'm in Beirut and we don't have 24-hour electricity here. And there's a, you know, I mean, it's maybe not funny, but a joke we make in Lebanon is, you know, the Israelis are always threatening to bomb our electricity plants and people
No
will say,
need.
okay, like what you're not gonna, unless you want to go bomb all the neighborhood generators,
Which
like
they've probably planned for.
yeah, maybe. I mean, maybe they've got the coordinates. I don't know, but then they're going to have a bunch of neighborhood generator gangs to deal with on their hands. But no, I mean, all that's of course in jest. But in all seriousness, you know, you do have obviously segments of the Israeli government who very much want to go to war in the north against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and it's a part of needing that victory narrative as well. On the one hand, there's the more right-wing fanatical crazies who just want to destroy Lebanon to take more territory. And then there's, the sort of more politically savvy ones who recognize that they need a victory in order to get their people to go back to the north, because right now a significant number of Israelis have left the north because it's being hit by Hezbollah and this kind of tit for tat, and they don't feel comfortable going back because Hezbollah is this big threat, and on and on and on. All that's to say, sometimes when when I think about Lebanon and the potential for a broader scale war here, I don't see it breaking out into a bigger war because the Israelis have so much to lose if they provoke a wider war because of how much damage Hezbollah can do to them. But then, sometimes I also wonder, is that resting too much on Israeli rationality? Uh, because yes, there are some rational actors in Israel in the sense of they have you know, some semblance of like self-preservationist mentality. Uh, but at the same time, what they're doing is also insane for and not sustainable for the future. So I don't really know if they're rational. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on Israel's level of rationality here.
Well, rationality works in mysterious ways. You know, one rational analysis would be to say that if Israel insists on invading Lebanon, it risks transforming its failure in the Gaza Strip. And I think um, it is a failure, but also not more than a failure, into a strategic defeat in Lebanon and the region. Um, I'm and another rational analysis would say that Israel may be sufficiently confident that if it attacks Lebanon, that Iran will also get involved, and that particularly in the context of a U.S. election year will force the hand of the Biden administration to become directly engaged and fulfill Israel's longstanding wet dream of a direct military confrontation between the United States and Iran. Look, I'm not a specialist on the Second World War, but I imagine that in 1939 and 1940 and up until the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, you had senior German commanders and perhaps others in the German elite advising Hitler of the absolute craziness of invading the Soviet Union and transforming it into a two-front war. Well, he did so anyway, and it was the end of the Third Reich. Um, so, we can sit here and talk about how irrational it would be for Israel to invade Lebanon. And I'm sure there are also those in the Israeli security establishment and elites and in the economic elite and so on who feel similar. But that doesn't mean it's not going to happen. Governments take irrational decisions all the time. But I do think that if Israel does invade Lebanon, it will have a exponentially larger problem on its hands than it has had so far. I mean, you look at, for example, Palestinian missile attacks on Israel, particularly between October and December, until they became, much more few and far between. Well, they managed to paralyze daily life in much of central Israel, but the amount of damage that they did on military facilities, infrastructure, and so on was very, very limited because they simply don't have the capacity. Well, Hezbollah is a very different kettle of fish. If Hezbollah begins targeting Israeli military facilities and critical infrastructure, it's not going to survive Hezbollah onslaught. And even more so, if in response to an Israeli attack on Lebanon, Iran enters the fray.
Right.
It's to me very unclear whether it will or it won't under such circumstances, because of course it has various other considerations. But will, for example, such a conflict, if it exposes further Israeli weakness, lead to a Syrian attempt to liberate the Golan Heights, or an attempt by others from within Syria? How will the situation develop in countries such as Jordan and Egypt, which have thus far managed to contain popular sentiment and maintain their relationships with Israel? So it opens many, many new cans of worms that you would think anyone with common sense in Israel would advise against. But as we've seen, common sense is in increasingly short supply.
Yeah, and that's what makes it scary. You never know if they're playing the mad dog. The famous way to play geopolitics so that your enemies are too scared to mess with you, or if they're actually that insane.
Yes,
And
I
I
mean,
guess
if I can just interrupt you,
yeah, please.
dogs that constantly bark tend not to bite,
Yeah.
um, but sometimes they do.
Yes. Yeah. So I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens on the Lebanon front and all the other fronts and see just how insane Israel and their American backers are. I wanted to ask you about another development that we saw recently, which also received very little, if any, mainstream media coverage, and that is this the fact that we saw this piece in the Lancet, the most prestigious medical journal in the world, saying that the death toll in Gaza could be as high, if not higher than 186,000 people. And we've seen this widely repeated death toll of 40,000 in Gaza for months now, because their capacity to actually count the deaths has been wiped out, given the level of destruction across Gaza, especially to its medical infrastructure. So 186,000 people, 7.9% of the total population in Gaza, which is just a wild statistic. And that's a conservative estimate. And again, this news passed with very little attention. And I'm just curious your thoughts on that massive number.
Well, just by way of disclaimer, first of all, the authors of this letter to the editor did not say that this is the actual death toll, but that they make a conservative estimate about the very realistically expected death toll. And second of all, this was a letter to the editor rather than a peer-reviewed article. But having said that, the editors of the Lancet, which, as you mentioned, is arguably the world's most prestigious medical journal, felt this was a sufficient, serious examination to publish on their pages. And what the authors of this letter have done is examine the proportion of combat to non-combat fatalities that can be attributed to the armed conflict. And here they are looking at things such as the systematic destruction of the Palestinian health infrastructure in the Gaza Strip, the willful deprivation of food, of medicines, of clean water, and all these other factors. And looking at historically in other conflicts, the proportion between combat and non-combat fatalities and casualties, depending again on these underlying factors, and concluded that under current circumstances, it would be realistic and indeed conservative to estimate that between 7 and 9% of the population of the Gaza Strip will perish as a result of Israel's genocidal policies in the Gaza Strip. And what's interesting here is that a similar study was done in the aftermath of Protective Edge in 2014, which found that the overwhelming majority of Palestinian casualties were combat or died as a result of armed hostilities. In other words, if you weren't shot or bombed, you were in that small minority of casualties who died as a result of indirect effects of the war. The difference, of course, is that in 2014, the Gaza Strip still had a health infrastructure. It was still able to generally feed its people and supply them with minimally clean water and so on. The situation now is that many, many people are receiving non-life threatening wounds that in the context of the Gaza Strip are proving to be fatal. You have people dying of malnutrition. You have people unable to get regular medical care that are turning into fatal infections. And of course, you're seeing the rapid spread of communicable diseases such as hepatitis and others, and that's the analysis that's being presented in this letter. But again, you know, it goes against the narrative of heroic little Israel fending off the savage hordes from across its borders. So it's simply ignored.
You know, I recently was walking in the street and I walked by a motorcycle that was parked, but the exhaust, I guess, was still very hot. And I got a really horrible burn on my leg. I mean, I'm fine, but it's a burn that for the last week I've had to put gauze on and tape up and attend to. And I just keep thinking to myself, I mean, this is nothing. It's painful. It's a nuisance. It sucks. I have to clean this wound. And I just keep thinking about Gaza and how the injuries I'm looking at on these videos. And these are not second degree burns, which is something that heals in 3 weeks. As long as you put medicine on it and wrap it up. This is, people's jaws detached from their faces and just blood spewing out and amputations and, just horrific gashes and shrapnel stuck in bodies. And I don't even know, and no soap and water to clean them with. And I'm just I mean, having this little burn that I have, it's really painful. Having that, something as basic as that in Gaza, I can't even imagine, let alone the level of horrific injuries that I'm seeing. So yeah, you can imagine the people who are getting injuries that are totally treatable injuries, but maybe can't wash them or clean them properly or attend to them, and they get infected and cause, amputations or death. I mean,
well, there's that. People who, under normal circumstances, would have been saved by proper medical attention. And we're not talking about people who would only have survived if they had been immediately airlifted to the Mayo Clinic. We're talking about people who Gaza's pre-October existing health infrastructure had the capacity to treat and treat successfully. So there's a huge number of people in that category: destruction of the medical facilities, the killing of numerous medical personnel, the unavailability of proper machinery to excavate potentially still living casualties from under the rubble. There's that whole category. And then there's another category, diabetics who can no longer get insulin, people with chronic conditions, whether they require kidney dialysis or daily medication, who can't get it anymore and are doomed to die as a result. And then, of course, all the new diseases that are emerging. So it's a variety of causes, all leading, unfortunately, increasingly towards a single fatal effect. I'll give you an example. I spoke recently to an American doctor who had been in the Nasser hospital in Khan Yunis. I think it was late last year that he was there, or perhaps very early in 2024. And he was explaining how they would receive casualties in the hospital. They would provide them with whatever aid they could in terms of surgery and so on. And he said under normal circumstances, these patients would have survived, but they were so weakened by malnutrition that their bodies could not properly respond in terms of closing off the wounds through regeneration of skin or whatever. I have zero medical knowledge, so I'm just trying to repeat what he told me. And so there's all these underlying factors have a compound effect on I said combat and non-combat casualties. What I should have said was casualties that are directly attributable to armed hostilities versus those that are an indirect result of the armed conflict.
It's completely horrifying. I wanted to also ask, I mean, one of the wounds people are getting are by attacks by dogs.
Yeah.
And I raised that because, you recently tweeted some information about one of these attacks. I mean, I think a lot of us saw the story about the Palestinian man with Down syndrome who was literally left to die by Israeli soldiers after a combat dog attack. And then
Well,
you
the
added,
dogs were set upon him.
yes. and that's not the first time that's happened. The Israelis have been setting dogs on Palestinians. And then you noted that this dog was most likely proudly trained and enthusiastically delivered by the Netherlands. So that was a bit of a twist I wasn't expecting. Could you explain what
Yes.
you meant by that? Yeah.
Well, according to available reporting, Israel acquires most of its combat dogs from the Netherlands and where else? Germany. And the Four Winds canine combat dog breeder in the Netherlands, in fact, proudly advertises that for 20 years it has been the main supplier of such dogs to the Israeli military. It also claims to be the main exporter of such dogs to Africa and the Middle East more generally. There appear to be absolutely no export restrictions on these kinds of exports to the Israeli army, just as Europe effectively places no import restrictions on products from illegal Israeli settlements. There was a case, I believe, in 2017, where a Palestinian boy who was deliberately mauled by two of these dogs that had been set upon him by the Israeli military sued Four Winds Canine Company and was paid substantial damages. You know, the company at the time said it was an expression of goodwill and it accepted no responsibility for the consequences of its actions. But you know, this again goes to show that the relationships, the genocidal relationships, if you will, between the West and Israel go far beyond, you know, supplying 2,000-pound bombs and casting vetoes at the UN Security Council. There is an entire matrix, a network of genocide that extends very deeply into the very marrows of Western states and its economies.
And you know, I know we have to wrap up here, and I think something I'd like to end on with you is the fact that, you know, since I last had you on, there's been an explosion of activism in the U.S. around this issue, even prior to the campus protests. But I think the campus protests, you know, that's the most recent phenomenon we've seen. We've also, in conjunction with that, had these anti-Semitism witch hunts, which have become more brutal than they were before October 7th, which I guess is to be expected. But all that said, you know, support for Israel in the U.S., especially among young people, has taken an existential hit for the Israelis, which is probably why their supporters are turning to, you know, bullying and these kind of legal attacks, these attacks on people's livelihoods, even using Congress to call people out by name to suppress pro-Palestine sentiment. Do you think this is a long-term problem for the Israelis and ultimately for the U.S.?
Yes, I do. First of all, these protests have been nothing short of extraordinary and extraordinarily inspiring, I should add. Secondly, I think there's a fundamental difference between a state like Israel, if you compare it, for example, to, I don't know, Saudi Arabia or Ivory Coast or any of these others. You know, for the others, for what matters is their relationships with the U.S. government and being able to ensure the continued support of U.S. government. And where U.S. public opinion figures into this is at best marginal. For Israel, the support of public opinion is a strategic asset of the first order. And it has always treated it that way. And to see Israel now no longer becoming an issue of bipartisan consensus in the U.S., but one that is increasingly feeding into the existing polarization, where Israel is increasingly identified with one part of the U.S. political spectrum and increasingly alienated or alienating itself from the other. And on top of that, where you have growing numbers of interested citizens, whether in the United States or Europe, and certainly in the UK as well, either no longer supporting Israel, becoming indifferent to it, or even becoming actively opposed to it. This is a strategic threat to Israel. And that is why Israel is treating it as such and responding to it as such. I recently spoke with Norman Finkelstein, and I asked him if there was anything comparable to the kinds of witch hunts and firings and all the rest of it, and students being expelled and faculty being hounded and Ivy League university presidents being forced to resign. If there was anything similar during either the Vietnam War or during the Iraq War, distinction, of course, being that unlike the current situation, Vietnam and Iraq were both wars that the U.S. Was actively involved in. And his response was that there was nothing similar during either Vietnam or Iraq. There may have been a few incidents here or there, but in terms of the level of repression and suppression we're currently seeing, it's of an entirely different and unprecedented level. And yes, people are paying a cost. People are paying a significant cost, but they're not giving up. They're continuing, and several academics I've spoken to expect the campus protests to erupt once again when the academic year starts in the fall, because of all the unresolved issues that have been left when the previous academic year ended at the beginning of the summer. And so you look at all these extraordinary measures that Israel and its apologists and its flunkies and its supporters are taking. And what it demonstrates to me is not only the strategic significance of what's happening, but also that Israel recognizes that it has lost, that it is losing and it has lost, and that really the only quiver left in its arsenal is to resort to these sledgehammer tactics of congressional legislation, of formal legal measures. If you have the public on your side, you don't resort to the law. You don't resort to official institutions to impose your perspective on the population. And it shows also, I think, the growing schism between ruler and ruled, between government and the governed, in the West, and the fact that Israel and its apologists and its backers have to resort to these measures, I think shows that the tide has turned, that we have turned a corner, and I believe that for Israel, there's no going back to the good old days where it could be all things to all people, and anyone and everyone would ultimately find what for them was a rational reason why they supported Israel in its battle with the Palestinians and the Arabs in the region.
Yeah, it really does reek of just absolute desperation. And I guess that's it. Maybe we can call that a positive note to end on. Mouin, I want to thank you for joining me for the
Yeah.
hour to break all this down. Can you please let everybody know where they can follow your work and your commentary?
Yes, most of my work is available on Jadaliya, website that I help co-edit. It's www.jadaliya.com. And I also do a weekly interview this week in Palestine, or this week from Palestine, with Nassim Ahmed of Middle East Monitor, that is broadcast on their website. And I also tend to post things on my Twitter account.
Yeah, your Twitter account is excellent. I encourage everybody to follow all of that. And I want to thank you for joining me, and I hope we can do it again soon.
Thank you, Rania. I look forward to it.